Yes, hello again. Welcome back to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, which is now, as you know, completely ad-free, so none of those annoying advertisements at the beginning of the videos to spoil your viewing pleasure. Now, we're currently in the process of killing time until we head off to our next outdoor race event, which of course will be Cecil Pearson's two-day charity scramble event, which is held in Northern Ireland each year, and those guys raise some fantastic amounts of money for local charities during that two-day event. So I'm looking forward to heading back over to Northern Ireland here in 2024. But until then, we're going to dive into the Rob Hughes classic dirt bike collection, and right now we're going to take a look at another bike from Rob's massive collection of old school vintage classics. So let's dive straight in here and take a look at his 1978 580 CCM. So it's thanks once again to this man here on the right, Rob Hughes, for supplying this week's featured bike. And if you're a regular visitor to my CDB TV channel, then you may have already seen more examples of the rare bikes that Rob has in his collection. And not only does he have some of the most rare and unique off-road bikes from around the world, Rob also has one of the best collections of Allan Clews CCMs, not only here in the UK, but possibly even in Europe and beyond. And Rob can certainly boast that he has a copy of every single CCM model that Allan Clews ever made, right from his first official 1973 bike right up to what was to be the last of the CCM motocrossers in 2011, which of course at that time had a CCM frame, but they were powered by a Yamaha YZ400 and 250 four-stroke engine. But even Rob has doubles of some of these CCM bikes in his assortment, and to see all of these machines in one single place is without doubt a treat for the eyes, especially if you're one of these people who are a CCM fan and a follower of all things Allan Clews. But the model that we're going to concentrate on today is this immaculate 1978 CCM 580 that, although this bike here's undergone a full restoration, it's nevertheless still authentic in every way to the bike that Allan Clews was building in that year. And as it turned out, 1978 was actually a very good year for Allan Clews and CCM, because the sales of those bikes were up, and the profit margins of the company were very healthy indeed. And 1978 was also the year that Allan teamed up with Westlake, the Speedway engine builder, to help him design their new 4-valve cylinder head for the B50 engine. And it would also be the year that Allan Clews and CCM would go on to build their own front forks for these bikes. So there was quite a lot going on in the CCM Bolton factory in 1978. Right, so the background and the story of our 1978 580 Clews Classic is that this bike here was another machine that was restored by classic bike builder Rod Spry. Now, you may remember that we featured another Rod Spry built bike just recently, that John Banks replica 500 Honda. So you can see that when a bike leaves the Rod Spry workshop, it's quite often in better than brand new condition. But these 1978 bikes were certainly one of the most popular sellers for CCM in that year. And in fact, more than half of CCM's annual turnover for 78 with regards their bike sales and parts were all destined for export. Now, also Allan Clews in that year produced a batch of just 30 works replicas, which were exact copies of the bikes that were being ridden by the works riders of the time, and they even had the same magnesium B50 motors and also the brand new longer CCM forks. And Allan sold those works bikes for exactly the same price that you would pay for a standard CCM bike, which I think at that time was around the £1,800 mark. So the people who bought those 30 examples certainly got themselves a bargain, because those bikes had a works specification with a much higher spec than the stock standard production machine, and of course for the exact same money. So beginning with the chassis on our 78 580, which as you know was made from the usual steel tubing, which also back then was chrome plated, and you can see that Rod Spry's also had this chassis recoated in a brand new covering of chrome plating. Now the swing arm once again was also redone at the restoration with brand new chrome and all of the other add-ons, including that bottom chain guide and that eccentric chain adjuster at the front was also given the same treatment. Although it is said that CCM never really continued with this chrome plating of their bike's chassis and swing arm, which was at that time a very costly and time-consuming practice, and it wasn't too long before they then reverted back to simply painting them instead. But another Allan Clews innovation was to fit the chassis footrest hangers onto the side of the engine's magnesium casings, where this would allow them to raise the pegs higher up the bike rather than mounting them lower down onto the bottom chassis rails in the usual fashion. Plus, by keeping them higher up, they'd also be less likely to catch or foul on the track when the bike was leaned hard over into a corner. Now, you may think that this unusual way of mounting the footrests onto the engine rather than fixing them onto the frame in the conventional manner would maybe put undue stress or strain on those precious magnesium casings, where in actual fact there was never ever a single case of casing failure on these B50s reported during the entire period of using this method. But I'm pretty sure that you're all already aware that this and many of the other CCM chassis in the past used the frame's front down tube as an oil tank for the motor's engine oil, which was filled through this little filler plug here on the top of the chassis, and the oil was then pumped around the motor and then back into the chassis through that little return pipe at the side of the filler. Which then brings us onto our CCM's power plant, which is a bored out BSA B50 engine, and this one here is now at 580cc as opposed to the stock standard 500. Now, this engine, as you'd expect, has undergone the usual improvements by scalloping or removing every second cooling fin on the barrel to reduce its overall weight, and some others also claim that this process helps to stop mud sticking in between the fins if you're racing the bike at a muddy race event, which of course if these fins do get clogged up with mud, it could then lead to the motor overheating and even in extreme cases possible seizures. But it also makes the engine look like a proper works motor with these fins removed. But as you can see, our particular B50 engine is just your stock standard 2-valve cylinder head, and you may remember that I told you at the beginning of this video that for 1978 Allan Clews was working alongside Westlake to develop a 4-valve head for this B50 engine. And in this short clip here of another Rod Spry CCM, you can see a version of that rare 4-valve head, and you can also see how radically different it is to the standard 2-valver. But it did take Allan Clews and Westlake a bit of time and experimentation with different profiles of camshafts to get things absolutely spot on. But once Allan had sussed out what was required to make this work, it was certainly a big improvement over the standard 2-valve head. But fixing that brand new head onto the BSA B50 engine was really just the beginning, because Allan then had to redesign the top of the bike's frame, because the 4-valve head was taller than the 2-valver, and Allan wanted to be able to lift the head off while the engine was still in the frame. But other little problems like the carburetor inlet stub being longer and the front exhaust port now in the centre of the head were just another couple of the engineering challenges that Allan Clews had to overcome to make this 4-valve top end successful. But the exhaust pipe on our 2-valve 580 engine is just a simple big bore straight through pipe with no real silencer or tailpipe to speak of, but it is, as you can see, all chrome plated. But basically it's just a two-piece shaped header pipe that then connects onto this short stubby tailpipe here that exits on the right hand side of the bike. But besides, you wouldn't want to fit a silencer anyhow to this engine, because you'd then muffle the sweet sound of that big B50 4-stroke engine. But to keep our big Clews bike fed with its fuel, it's quite a sizable Amal carburetor that has the job of pumping that gas and air mixture into the B50's cylinder head, and that carb draws its air supply through a foam air filter that's accessed from underneath the bike seat. And as we move on to the B50's transmission side, now it was a 3-speed gearbox, which was usually more than enough gears to hustle our CCM along at breakneck speed. And if you're familiar with these big CCM motors, then you'll know that all you really needed was just one gear to get you off the line and another to take you around the track. Such was the torque that was produced by these big 4-stroke engines. But I do remember that in 1979 you could also get this B50 engine with a 4-speed gearbox, but as I mentioned earlier, both of the outer casings on this motor were made of exotic magnesium, as of course were a few of the other parts on this Clews Classic. Now, the year previous, in 1977, Allan Clews was still using the Italian Marzocchi forks on the front of these CCMs, but Allan was always looking for Marzocchi to develop more travel on their front suspension systems, which eventually they couldn't deliver. And so Allan then did what any right-minded business would do. He just decided to design and build his own front suspension systems, because he'd already had plenty of experience modifying the old BSA and metal profile forks that he used on his bikes in the past. So Allan just went ahead and designed and built these brand new forks for his 1978 bikes that had very strong 38mm inner stanchions, and he also designed all of the inner hydraulics as well, with the lower part of the forks being cast in magnesium. But these brand new CCM forks were certainly a massive improvement over the Italian Marzocchis, and they had all the travel that Allan Clews needed on his new 78 models. And again, because Allan Clews designed and built these new forks, he also needed a new set of triple clamps, or yokes if you like. So these items here again were forged in magnesium, and just like the bike's new front suspension system, these were all very high quality and was exactly what was required to make these 78 racers perform better on the track. But as we move on to the bike's rear suspension, which back in 1978 were a pair of Girling emulsion dampers that Girling developed for these CCMs, because at that time Allan Clews wanted to have the same amount of travel at the back of the bike that he now had here at the front, and so Girling then designed and built shocks to suit this new bike. Now, I'm not saying that these are the self-same items that Girling made in that year, because as you'd expect, those originals are probably all long gone by now, and my suspicion here is that Rod Spry's just went ahead and fitted a pair of period correct similar items to this bike when he did the restoration. And anyhow, these shocks here will certainly be more likely to be of better quality and operation than those 46-year-old Girling emulsion dampers. Also for the 1970s, these 78 CCMs had these old school drum brakes on both the front and at the back, and our 580 here appears to still have the original CCM brake back plates, which is a very rare item to find on these bikes in this modern day. Although, as I remember, I think these old drum and shoe stopping systems were still efficient enough to slow or even stop our big Clews machine in full flight. And when you had the likes of the great Bob Wright and John Banks blasting around the track, then these brakes had to be ready for a rapid retardation. And also here at the back, you can see that our CCM has quite a sizable rear sprocket, which was, of course, to keep the gearing of the bike absolutely spot on with regards to that 3-speed gearbox. But you can imagine that there was quite a decent amount of horsepower being transmitted through this back wheel. Now, if you ever needed to adjust the chain tension on that rear sprocket, then you simply use these eccentric cam adjusters here at the front of the bike's swing arm. And with the mega power that was being supplied by that 580 B50 motor, then this chain certainly needed retensioning on a regular basis. But moving up onto our Clews 580's fuel tank, which as you can see is a beautifully sculpted alloy tank, which was quite a typical design on these CCM scramblers during the 1970s that did come in a variety of colours during that decade, with I think it was the 1977 bike previous to this that was just left in a simple polished alloy, while of course our 78 here has this nice black finish. And I think it was the 1980 bike that followed 2 years later that was painted in that glorious gold motif. But nevertheless, this alloy fuel cell here held about 1.5 gallons of fuel, which was usually more than enough to keep our B50 ticking over, even when it was being ridden to within an inch of its life by hard-charging riders like the great Bob Wright. So as we make our way onto the rider's seat now, this seat here on our 78, I suspect, isn't the stock original, but it's certainly without doubt a carbon copy of the standard item from way back in the day, because these parts here are now being reproduced for these older CCMs, and they're all made to the exact same specifications and quality from that time period. But as I've heard from the guys who actually rode these big CCMs back in 78, they all say that these were very well padded and super comfy as well. So I expect that this was quite a good place to rest your backside down on when you eventually came to a smoother part of the racetrack. But once more, I'm in guessing mode again, but I'm 99% sure that all of the plastics on our Rob Hughes racer are all reproduction parts, because let's face it, you're never going to find new replacement plastics as new old stock 78 items after 46 years. And this front number plate here is quite a good identifiable example that these are reproduction parts, because if this was a 100% bona fide CCM original, then this top part of the plastics would have had Castrol stamped into the plastic, where of course Castrol were a major sponsor of CCM in that year. And I expect that the Castrol part of these reproduction parts is not allowed nowadays, probably due to some kind of copyright legislation. But these handlebars fitted here certainly appear to be the real deal, because I think CCM did fit these kind of bars to their 78 bikes with that crossbar bracer there welded on and not clamped on, as is the normal with modern day race bikes. But the Gunnar gasser throttle certainly looks right for the time period, and those Magura alloy levers as well. But the rubber grips on this bike are Scott items, which I'm sure are once again just normal motocross bike parts that you can either pick up at any off-road store or online outlet. But I did have the privilege of spending 2 full days filming many of the bikes that Rob has in his collection, and even then I never managed to catch a glimpse of every single bike that he had. And if Rob ever opens up his collection to the public, then I can certainly see it being a shrine for all CCM fans, because as I said, you're never going to find as many examples of the great Allan Clews dynasty in one place at one time than the bikes that Rob's all collected together, and it's not only his CCMs but many of the other rare machines as well. So if it ever comes to pass that Rob opens his doors to the public, then for sure you're in for a very special treat. But they do say that 1978 was the golden year for Allan Clews, because everything just seemed to go right for the company with the development of the new 4-valve head for the B50 motor, and of course the design and construction of their new own front forks. And on top of all that, 1978 was also the year that CCM started making their first ever trials bike with the BSA 250 and 350 engines, which again was a great success for Clews in that particular year. And of course, in the following year, in 1979, Allan continued to build his big B50 4-stroke thumpers, but was now moving into the smaller CC bike market, where he'd then build a new 2-stroke lightweight racer, which used an Italian 125 or 250 2-stroke high-row motor. And in this picture here of a 1979 250 gives you just a small insight into Allan's vision for that particular year. But then again, that's another story for another video. So there you have it, another nice classic from the Rob Hughes collection of old dirt bikes. That's his 1978 580 CCM. But as I said, coming up next here on CDB TV, we'll be making our annual pilgrimage to the Emerald Isle to cover Cecil Pearson's 2-day charity event, which as you know, raises some fantastic amounts of money for the local charities in the area. So we're looking forward to helping Cecil out with that event. And don't forget, you can see all of the bikes and all of the racing from that 2-day charity event right here on my channel soon after my return. But once again, thanks for watching my video channel, and if these are the kind of bikes that you like to look at here on YouTube, then I do hope you will consider subscribing. But until the next time, from all of us here at CDB TV, it's goodbye for now.